Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. Feel free to settle in here. We'll get started in about 2 to 3 minutes, so no rush. Get a cup of coffee, check an email, get your lunch, whatever it may be, and we will be starting shortly. Thank you. So do you guys both have nice weather happening at least?
Yeah, it's great today. I'm in New England, in Massachusetts, so it's in the 60s today and sunny.
That's perfect.
Yeah, we're probably about the same in the Bay Area.
Very nice. Yeah. Here in Minnesota, it's about 70. No bugs yet, so it's really like the perfect, no mosquitoes. It only lasts like 7 days, so.
Yeah, well, like May and September are like in San Francisco when we have summer. Like that's when it's really nice and warm. Everyone thinks that San Francisco's biggest economy is tech. It's actually fleeces to people who are like, oh, I'm going to California in the summer. And it's like,
yep, like I didn't pack that. Oh yes, I do need this.
It's 45 in the morning. What? Don't worry, it'll go up to 65. But
yeah, that was eye-opening when I spent time up there. And I lived in Danville. So then when I go to the Bay Area, like it was like a 20-degree difference easily.
Oh, it can be, yeah, especially but if it's really hot and like out in the East Bay, Danville and like Pleasanton, 20, 30 degrees is not a big deal. And that was when I first moved here because I'm from the East Coast. It was got in a car, had a short sleeve shirt on and forgot to get up. It's like, oh, this is a lot different.
Yeah, like I need my fleece. Yep. Hello, everyone. We'll be getting started in about 1.5 minutes. So Chris, you're on the East Coast. I was thinking you were in Colorado.
No, a lot of the team is in Colorado, but we're completely remote. So we have people all over the country. Nice. And yeah, I'm on the East Coast.
Beautiful. That does make it fun now to really like know where people are, because you used to have a pretty good idea, but now it's like, wow, you can be anywhere.
Yeah, I'm curious what's going to do to all of our accents since we're all moving around the country. Just a big normalization of accents.
Hopefully you don't end up with a Minnesota one like me.
I can barely detect it.
Oh, the always it will come out. It always does.
There it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, I work hard at sort of minimizing my Philadelphia accent. So I'll drop an occasional water and whatnot from time to time.
It is what it is. Embrace it at this point in my life. I mean, this cookie is just staring me in the face, and I feel like we should probably just get started. We got our participants rolling in a few minutes here after the hour. So we're going to kick it off for this awesome Monday. Welcome, everyone. I am Tiffany Service Gustafson, a digital strategist here at BWG Connect, and we are a network and knowledge sharing group. That's what we do. We stay on top of the latest trends, challenges, whatever it is that's shaping the digital landscape that we love. We are on track to do almost 500 of these webinars this year due to the increase in demand to better understand everything digital. We'll also be doing at least 100 in-person small format dinners this year. So if you happen to be in a tier 1 city, feel free to shoot us an email and we'd be happy to send you an invite. These dinners are typically 15 to 20 people having a specific discussion around a digital topic, and it's always an awesome time. We have a lot of conversations here at BWG Connect, whether it is through dinners, webinars, phone calls. It's how we generate the topic ideas for future events. And we'd love to have a conversation with you. So feel free to drop me a line at Tiffany, Tiffany at bwgconnect.com. It's from these conversations, we also gain our resident experts, such as Hero Digital and FullContact, who's here today. Anybody that we ask to come teach the collective team has come highly recommended from multiple brands within the network. So if you're ever in need of any recommendations on anything in the digital space, feel free to reach out to me. Happy to provide you a short list of the best of the best. And we also know that there's a lot of people hiring right now. So do note that we have a talent agency, BWG Talent, that we'd be happy to put you in contact with. A few housekeeping items. We start a few minutes after the hour, so rest assured we will wrap up at least 5 minutes before the end of the hour to give you ample time to get to your next meeting. And the most important part, we want this to be fun, educational, conversational. So do not hesitate to put in the chat any questions or comments you may have. If you feel more comfortable, always feel free to reach out to me via email at Tiffany, Tiffany at bwgconnect.com, and we'll be sure to get to them. So with that, let's roll and start the cookieless present, not future, where the future is here, the present, discovering new ways to collect data and gain insights into your customers. The team at Hero Digital and FullContact have been awesome friends, partners of the network. So I'm going to kick it off to you, Kevin and Chris. If you can give intro on yourself and your organization, that'd be great. And then we'll hop into the information. Thank you.
Absolutely. Nice to meet everyone and excited to talk about this topic today. It's certainly very something that we started talking about a few years ago, and I feel like I now have conversations about it daily. So I'm Kevin Lazorik. I'm the Senior Vice President of Alliances and Co-Founder at Hero Digital, and very excited to have one of our strategic partners, FullContact, here with us today. Chris?
All right. Thank you, Kevin, and thank you, Tiffany. It's a pleasure spending some time with you today, Kevin, and talking about this topic. Like you said, this seems to be a topic on everyone's mind, and the good brands are really coming up with incredible strategy around how to work in this new economy, and especially around identity and how to engage their customers. So as Kevin said, I'm with FullContact. We are an identity resolution company. We help companies with their identity strategy around their customers. We also work within identity verification and fraud to help companies ensure that the people that they're interacting with are real people, they're not bots or synthetic accounts, but actually the customer that they think they are when they're signing up accounts. So I have deep experience in MarTech and AdTech since the late 90s. And it came on board FullContact several years ago, helping them with the strategy. And like I said, it's a pleasure working with you today.
Awesome. Thank you both. All right, Kevin, are we going to jump in?
Yeah, and I think as we, areas of this trend have been spoken about for quite some time in different areas. It's either that third-party cookies are going away, different ad identifiers are going away, and what is Apple blocking versus other things are being allowed. But it's really part of a broader trend towards consumer control of privacy. And in looking at that, these tactics and techniques and capabilities that brands, particularly marketers, have come to rely on, have gone away or shifted or will be shifting in the future. And it's not a static shift. It's a much more dynamic environment than it was 3, 4, 5 years ago. And so really every brand is now a data company. If you want to do personalized experience, you want to optimize your digital channels, your mobile app, voice, whatever it might be, you're not as capable of just like, oh, we'll just plug this in and we have this information now. It's a big shift that come with consumer expectations as well. And how brands respond is really how they can differentiate themselves in the future. And so let's just talk about a few of these trends that are driving this today. But if we start by pausing here, I like to do this, and in the still somewhat rare occasion I get to do it in person, I ask for people to guess, but ask yourselves, if you were to say, what % of US adults openly use at least one privacy tool when online? I will tell you, I get answers from 5% to 50 to 90. It's a pretty wide guess, and the actual answer here is 77%. So 77% of people, and this is in 2019, nothing was happening by default at this point, are using an ad blocker, a tracking script blocker, a VPN, something to give themselves some amount of control within that, within their digital presence and who they are online. And so a lot of the initial things that you see from, technology companies and others, when it talks about these cookies and, tracking going away, they would say, hey, do people even really care about this? And the answer is yes, they do. The vast majority do. And this is something that will continue to shift over time. And that gets into really this aspect of a brand when we think about trust and what trust means as a brand and our relationship with our consumers. And so, Chris, I think this is an area where you can really chime in on like the trust economy and what that means for brands.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, I heard someone talk about this recently. So we've only been working on our social norms for centuries, and we're trying to squeeze it into these new digital platforms that we've built in the last 20 years. So there's a lot that needs to be built yet as it relates to trust. And when you hear the term kind of trust economy, I mean, typically what that's referring to, like the most use cases you might hear are things like Airbnb or Uber. So the ability to, create a business based on the trust and kind of operationalizing that trust within either an application, an app, or the way, or that brand in terms of how that brand works. So the trust economy, I think, is important because I think what you're starting to see as we start thinking about the way things are shifting with regard to privacy, but also security, regulations, and then just the advancement of technology around identity and the new social norms as it relates to being online all the time. So we all just went through this huge experiment during the pandemic where we're working at home, we're online a lot. A lot of the commerce shifted online. I think the most recent statistic is like $48 trillion will move into the digital economy over the next decade. So we're going through this massive experiment now where we're living a lot of our lives and all of our economy now online. And within that, we're trying to build up these new foundations of trust. And I think we're still in the very, early stages of that journey in trying to squeeze in our social norms around how we would typically interact with people face to face versus now interacting with companies, brands, and each other online. And so that's a lot of I'm not going to speak to all of the issues online, but at least as it relates to identity and trust, that's really what we're talking about here. And I think the big kind of mega trend that you're hearing about is kind of the shift from the Web 1.0, which is kind of the definition of HTML and URL and HTTP, to Web 2.0, which is really the advancement in kind of apps and social media, et cetera, to Web 3.0, which, coming from the marketing space is a great marketing term, but the definition is still being figured out, honestly. But what we do know in terms of even though we don't have a precise meaning, Web 3.0 is really what it's trying to refer to is the fact that both identity and content or data and things like that are being decentralized, basically giving more control back to the users, back to the people themselves over their digital presence. And so a lot what we do at FullContact is giving both those people, the consumers or just real people, control, but also the brands in which they interact with. So we're constantly kind of trying to dynamically manage, the boundaries of our privacy in the brands we're engaging with. And I think what's happened in the past is it's been disintermediated by a lot of other parties trying to manage identity or manage the data on behalf of brands and in which consumers are interacting with. Now what we're trying to do is give control back to the brands and their customers to manage the identity and to manage the interaction directly with that customer. And I think what you're going to see is more and more of this as we start to build up the kind of trust layer underneath our digital economy today. A lot of companies trying to build that, but also relying on other companies, digital trust agents, to help them manage their first-party relationships with their customers.
Awesome. Just a friendly reminder to everybody listening, feel free to drop in the chat any questions you may have, or feel free to email. It's a lot of great content here. Thank you.
And I think that, one of the big factors in trust that we've seen in this trend that's been evolving is the end of third-party cookies, right? So this today is one of the most talked about privacy topics that are impacting marketers. Obviously, Apple led the way, but everyone's been following suit. So we'll dive a bit more deeply into this, but it's something that's on everyone's mind as we're going through these. And really, why is it impacting people? So if you look at browser adoption across the board, yes, Chrome, which does still support third-party cookies by default, is half of the total market share within the US. But if you step into mobile, in the US, the majority of people tend to have an Apple device, and those things are blocked. So that's why we started shifting from like the cookieless future to the cookieless present. This is today, right now. If you're heavily dependent on third-party cookies for retargeting and other capabilities, it's not happening on the majority of mobile devices here in the US, and this trend will continue to get tighter. So a quote that I love and written here is from David Camp, Senior Vice President at Mozilla, when they followed suit and copied but modeled after what Apple did with blocking third-party cookies. Is the quote is, expecting users to spend their time understanding privacy implications rather than using the web they want to use is not the best path. So this end user centric perspective it's not grabbing hold, it has grabbed hold and is continuing to go and gain traction. So as brands, this is the perspective that will win over time. What does our user want and how are we meeting that need will never serve you wrong as a brand, as a marketer, as an organization that's trying to be client first. And that's an example of really, I think, where leading brands are starting to differentiate. We did talk about Chrome does still support these. There was a plan that it was going to be all wrapped up by the end of this year. It's now looking towards middle of 2023 that this will be phased out as they look and sort of formalizing how Google's want to replacing it. But I think people are starting to understand oh, Google gave us an extension, we still have time. No, you don't. Google's the only one really remaining standing in that camp, and even then they're moving away, and it's going to be sort of an iterative move. So the future is now. These are act like they're gone, and you'll be ready as you move forward. The other key element to recognize within all these topics is that as more and more data that we used to consider non-PII is starting to be classified potentially as PII. And so there's various amounts of government regulation. We all know GDPR, we've all lived through that, but CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act, is a big one, but Massachusetts, New York, Hawaii, Maryland, this is just the short list. There's a vast number of states who are rolling out their own opportunities, and some of these are ones where it would be, like Hawaii and Maryland, for example, suits can be bought by the Attorney General. But in California, Massachusetts, New York, the way these are written is that an individual could bring this against a company if their data was mismanaged. So there's a lot of changes, and we talk about a lot of carrots and what it can mean if we really embrace this, but there's some sticks as well. As the government is starting to change what PII is, the responsibilities that brands have in managing this data, if they have it, and so really owning that moving forward is a key change for brands to go and embrace. This isn't a one-time, let's drop some script that people opt into cookies and we're good now. There's a lot more consideration that needs to go into a lot of these changes.
And PII is personal identifiable information.
That's correct. Personally identifiable information, any piece of data that can tie back to an individual. And that's where if you have what sometimes are zombie data, PII that you don't want, maybe if you're a well-established brand 20 or 30 years ago, some system somewhere thought it was good to ask for people's social security numbers, and you have no need for them in your business, they might still be living somewhere, and that's a problem, right? So those types of things are things that all brands are looking forward to, and how do they manage that? And so just to do a slightly deeper dive into third-party cookies and why they're a problem, and ultimately it comes down to consent. We use apps, we use for data, we have to opt in to information, but with third-party cookies, the way they work is you don't. Someone, a site can drop that cookie on there and then follow you around other places around the web and know what you're doing. And you never said, I'm okay with that, right? And there might be certain aspects that you are okay with. We all like getting the right product recommended to us. I think that streamlines our journey of what we're trying to get done. But that lack of consent of what's being collected and what's being done with it is ultimately what led to this change. And if you think about how studies have shown that you can identify 87% of the people in the US if you know 5-digit zip code, gender, and date of birth. So those 3 data points let you identify 87% of the people. And you can just imagine what little bits of other pieces of data you can go and easily complete out that final 13%. And so if you're someone like me and you've been to wine.com before, it's like, yeah, I've pretty much have to give you all that information just to get on the site, right? So this focus on what do you know about me is a big topic. And so this focus on how that it exploits that, that relevant information, so that lack of opt-in is really the blocker that led to the shift that we're all going through and reacting today. And I always like to call out that sort of consent and opt-in and clarity around what you're asking for from data, how you're going to use the data, because that's something that is really a big part of how people are now starting to look at, well, what are you asking for and why? I got my very first iPhone. It was like, we'd like to have your, it didn't even ask for location, I think, if I remember correctly. You could just have it. Then they like, cool, can we know your location? Like, yeah, sure. Why does this, where did I park my car app need all this other data besides my location? Then that comes in. And so there is a real impact to marketers here. So ad targeting and retargeting, the common techniques you do today are much more difficult, right? So some of the metrics you're going to use around that for measurement and attribution are also going to shift. So yes, Google has the privacy sandbox and works with other APIs for things they can do within there to help with that. But our default thinking of, oh, well, this is the metric we're looking for, those numbers are going to be evolving of what like a good metric is around that, depending on your industry and some of the things that you're using. And then lastly, marketing tool changes. So it's very unique where a lot of times within technology, we have a number of different ways of doing things that evolve to a set of standards, right? This is one of the few cases, maybe only case, where we're sort of going in the opposite direction. We have a standard way, and now all these ad tech companies, other marketing solution companies are looking at how they're going to go and solve these capabilities. So if you're a marketer, talk with your vendors, your technology vendors on what they're doing to address this, because there's no single silver bullet way to say, oh, I was doing this, I'm going to do this now. There are some real ways that we'll get into in a few minutes that will help there, but it's not oh, we're doing A, now we do B, and everything's the same. It's a bigger shift than that. And lastly, to highlight on the customer being in control, this is a survey that Forrester did in 2020, where they said, well, what would motivate you to share more information with companies? And the first answer is nothing. You have enough about me already. Why would I give you any more? As number two is cash. Pay me. Give me that data. And maybe some brands have unique ways they can do that elsewhere. But then you get into, I think, some of the more actionable responses. So loyalty programs. If you have a loyalty program today or are thinking about rolling one out, it's a really unique opportunity for people who are going to be sharing more information about themselves. You can incentivize them, giving you information on how they're going to use. I think the next bullet is a really interesting one of the choice to opt out in the future. So, hey, I'll give you this information about myself. That could be helpful in what I'm trying to do right now. A year or two from now, I might be less willing to share that information. So if I have an opt-out, that level of control is what would go and shape some of my thinking. So those are all different ways when you think about your audience, why your audience is engaged with you, what's going to resonate with them can really vary. But there are incentives that you can put in place as a brand, besides just we'll pay you for the data, to go and help and augment those needs. But with that, Chris, I'd love to hand to you of, what are some more specific things that brands can be doing as they're looking around what they're doing with their data, customer expectations around privacy, and how that's shifting.
Yeah, thanks. So I think you hit on a couple of terms that I think, a lot of marketers are hearing over and over again. One is, we mentioned personal identifiable information, and we also talk about first party. So I think there's a big difference. Obviously, we're talking about third-party cookies, but we're really not talking about the fact that you still need to have a good, close relationship with your customers, and building up that first-party relationship is incredibly important. Gain their trust, make sure that you're being transparent in terms of how you are collecting data, what you're using that data for, as well as the partnerships you have in terms of who you're going to be making that data visible to. I think what you're going to see more and more of with brands is a lot more collaboration. I mean, we're seeing it both across brands to brands, but brands to technology companies and digital trust agents, like FullContact, and even public-private type of collaboration. So we're still trying to work out a lot of how to build the trust and creating the technology to build the trust with consumers. But the first thing starts with you've got to have good brand integrity and the ability to give your customers the ability to opt in or out, give or revoke consent, and understand through transparency how you've collected that data, what are you using it for, and allow them to change those boundaries when need be. And I think this goes beyond just consent management, but also goes into, are you working with other companies that are aligning to your privacy policies? Are you exposing that to your customers to make sure that they understand that as well? And then there's a lot of other, I think, additional, what I'd say more Web 3.0 type of abilities that you can think about in terms of context, influencer marketing, and other types of things that are happening with regard to digital identifiers, et cetera, that allows the consumer to actually be in more control of their personal data and who they are willingly giving that information to if they give the proper value exchange. And so I think a lot of that is happening. And so I'll go through a little bit of, historically here, as we mentioned, a lot of the data being collected is happening through other platforms, third-party platforms, social being one of the primary, but there's other types of platforms as well that are collecting that data. And it's not necessarily the direct interaction of the customer to the brand that they're engaging with, through, let's say, through a commerce transaction. So what's happening, like I mentioned before, is that relationship is being disintermediated by third parties. And so in that, it was working well. We were able to engage and especially with our digital advertising, be able to reach a large audience. But there was very little permissioning that was happening there within that exchange and less transparency. There really wasn't a great understanding of who was getting that information and what they were using it for beyond that explicit boundary extension to the brand that I like, that I'm engaging with. So what's changing now, obviously, as I mentioned, is we need to be able to give more controls back to brands in order to give them back to the customer that they're engaging with. And then, as we give consumers more control, the other thing you start to see is things like the creator economy emerging, where the consumer is now in more control of the content they're creating, the data they're creating, and they may choose to monetize that information as they see fit. And so when we think of creator economy, a lot of people think of Etsy, the fact that I'm creating something and I have the ability to kind of manage my own personal brand in a much more explicit way and monetize it. But the creator economy can extend well beyond that. So I think there's going to be more tools for people to actually monetize that data. And in the meantime, as that starts to emerge, I think you've got to build up that first party relationship and to honor the permissions that you have from the customer in which you're interacting with. And the first party data strategies also, when we talk about this in the context of privacy, oftentimes security matters too. So it's not just, am I capturing the consent, or am I capturing permission or opt-in for different types of interactions with customers? Am I also securing that data? Am I actually kind of reducing the amount of data that I'm managing in order to reduce the blast radius of potential identity theft or breach of information? So security matters there too. So if I'm a brand and I'm interacting with my customers, I'm not just thinking about the regulations that I have to abide by, but also I have to build trust, give control, and secure that to be a good steward of the data in which I'm managing. All these are really important strategies in terms of controlling data and giving control back to consumers. Yeah, and so I think, and I touched on this just briefly there, but balancing the need to build first-party data versus the risks of PII. So again, PII is personally identifiable information. A lot of companies, the personal data is toxic. So, and if you think about it, it's like if I'm collecting a lot more data than I really need, then I'm increasing the risk to my brand, I'm increasing the risk to the consumer as well. So what a lot of companies are starting to do is reducing the risk of managing that by taking that information and putting it aside, either encrypting it or letting someone else manage the PII itself, allowing me what I do best, which is giving the customer a great experience as a brand. So there's a lot of ways to do this. I mean, but primarily at the, it's minimalizing the type of information you're collecting or storing. And if you do collect things that are of higher risk or a higher data classification from a risk perspective, then use encryption in order for you to be able to store that in a way that is not easily accessible by prying eyes. And then minimalizing the number of people who can actually access that. So that's an important part of the strategy too. The other thing is, if you're exchanging data with partners, what are less risky ways to exchange data? Well, I'll talk about a few of those, but are there ways in which you don't actually have to exchange PII to be able to exchange insights? Or can you introduce certain types of information to the exchange so that there's no way in order to be able to de-anonymize the information and get back to the individual? So these are all ways to reduce the risk of managing personal data.
That's awesome. Friendly reminder, put in your questions, comments in the chat, or feel free to email me. This is great information.
Yeah, I wanted to just double click on the content creators, or the creator economy, a little bit. So again, what is the creator economy? So it's basically, it emerges from the dialogue you might hear around Web 3.0, but it basically means that the users are getting more control of their data. This is leading to more of the creator economy. And this is basically the ability for you to monetize your personal brand or your hobbies, etc. And having, in this case, the ability to monetize it in a way that you own the relationship directly because you're creating the content. So imagine like a celebrity and their direct interaction with their fan base. But there's a lot of companies that would be very interested in understanding the fan bases themselves, or have direct access to them, or go through or work through influencer marketing, or the ability to understand how across different types of artists or celebrities, etc., or athletes, actually how many of those audiences actually overlap. Very interesting insight. But again, it's less orchestrated by the platforms, more orchestrated by the actual content creator themselves. And so we see this as a big emerging trend. And you can imagine, as a brand, this is very interesting information. I'm not just depending on modeled data to try to figure out the likes and interests of people, but I now have directly observed information from the people they're interacting with, the content creator themselves, over what their likes and interests are, and that audience, and direct access to that audience for my brand. So this is one emerging trend which we're paying a lot of attention to right now, and working with some companies to help them participate with their brand in terms of deepening the relationships through the content creators themselves, and honestly giving back to the people who are creating a lot of what is happening in the digital economy itself.
Very cool.
Yeah, and so one of the ways we're doing this, and I just want to talk about the technology a little bit, because it goes back to protection of the data itself. Basically using clean room technology. So there's a lot of emerging companies within this particular category. It's actually a concept that's been around for decades, which is the ability for two independent entities. In this case, we use an example like an artist and a brand, to be able to actually see the overlap between their customers or fans. Using clean room technologies means that they're not actually giving their data away to someone else, let's say another partner or entity, but they're using an intermediary like FullContact to help them do that. And then they share the insights on both sides, as long as there's permission to do so. So they can share insights, so they can actually use those insights actually to reach those audiences online, either through social media or other types of digital media. So this is a big trend. I think a lot of companies, like I said, are thinking less about third party and more about second party. Kind of how can they exchange insights? How can they make sure that insight is actually done in a way to protect personal identity or personal data, but also but be very transparent about who their partners are, and that those partners align with their privacy policies. So very big trend that I think is very important for marketers to pay attention to. And so what are some other things that, newer capabilities, that are emerging with regard to this space? I mean, I think one of the things that I wanted to talk about here is kind of the mega trend also just around identity. So it's not just that, we talk about things like giving control over, et cetera, to the user, to the brand, et cetera, but also these bigger concepts of what is happening with identity in general. So you've got really three different types of identity that we're all dealing with simultaneously right now, because we haven't completely adopted kind of or fast forwarded towards a user or customer centric model of identity management. So what you still have today is you have siloed identity. So that's when, let's say your credentials or the information itself is kind of managed by the domain or the company in which you're interacting with. That's a very traditional way of kind of managing identity. But the second would be federated identity. And so think of like single sign-on as a federated identity. So you saw a lot of companies like, Apple, Google, Facebook introduce these single sign-on types of capabilities, where the companies that are using them can embed them because they've agreed on the interoperability of that technology itself, what the user experience is like, what's being, who's going to be controlling that identity itself, et cetera. And so that's been adopted. You've seen a lot more of that. We're all experiencing that with single sign-on, but that's a federated identity. And then you have decentralized identity, which is what I've been alluding to as kind of the trend, is where we're moving towards the kind of Web 3.0 trends, where that is where the individual is interacting directly with the brand, but probably controlling their own identity over time. Perhaps they have a digital wallet or some sort of electronic identifier online or digital identifier, but they're kind of managing it. And typically that's reliant on maybe a device or other types of ways in which they're managing their identity. So the really confusing thing, I think, for marketers and everyone else is that all three of these are in existence simultaneously right now. You have siloed identity, you've got federated identities, and you've got decentralized identity trends that are starting to emerge. So I think for a brand, what's really important is they have to be able to maintain their identity itself, but also I think use what I would call digital trust agents. So that's a company like FullContact or others that are doing things like identity verification or doing things like building out identity graphs for you on your behalf, so that you can always maintain that identity over time, a persistent identifier, secure the PII, enable the insights without actually letting data or personal data leak, but also being able to do true kind of measurement across all of your customers and over time, and be able to recognize those customers as well. So I think it's very important that we understand that this is a very dynamic time as it relates to identity. But what I can say for certain is that you have to be able to manage your first party data and the identity around your customers. And you have to pay attention to that as it relates to these things, security, privacy, as well as the ability to do data exchange in a privacy by design way. So that's what we talk about when we say private identity cloud. It's actually your ability within your company to manage identity in a privacy safe way, but give you as much fidelity as you can around recognition of your customers and the maintenance of that ID over time, so that in protecting the personal data through all of the operations of your business.
And staying in compliance of all the ever-changing laws.
That's right. Yeah. Are you keeping track of privacy within some sort of permission ledger, for example? Are you actually exchanging that information with downstream partners? Do you have some form of governance around those partners to ensure that they are abiding by those same standards in which you've collected that data from your customer? So all of that is important. Being able to wrap that into a solution to allow you to ensure that you have a stable privacy foundation or ballast behind your business.
Perfect. It was a very well-timed slide to the question that we had in the audience of, how do you collect the data digitally? I think that's perfect segue into this discussion.
Yeah, I mean, so data collection, so I think there's not one data collection mechanism, right? There's a number of different ways you collect data. It could be through, for example, collecting an opt-in for an email and then sending emails and then collecting data about those emails as they open and click on those emails. It could be through digital advertisement, being able to buy advertisement against an audience and you may or may not have insight into the specifics around that audience itself, depending on that platform. So how do you collect that data in a way to make it usable? I mean, I think what I'm highlighting in the previous slide was just basically whenever you're collecting PII or personal data, you want to be able to have a standard way in which that data is being protected. Well, so for example, when we help our customers facilitate that, when data is being collected, we actually encrypt it in transfer, you encrypt it at rest, and then you protect the keys themselves, and then you limit the exposure of who gets access to those keys. And then any identifier you use from that point forward isn't reversible, so that you can't actually look at the identifier and recognize any of the identity of the individual. And there's no logic in which you can actually reverse it back to the individual and recognize them or de-anonymize them in any way. So these are all really important standards in terms of your collection. Immediately onboard that data collection through mechanisms like that, no matter where you're collecting it. So anyway, that's a few insights there. All right, and then web recognition. One of the reasons for this is just to point out that third-party cookies are going away, first-party cookies are not. It's really important for you to build up a capability around first-party data collection, specifically on the web, and to be able to recognize returning customers, returning businesses to your site, etc. And so that will still be there, as well as the ability for you to partner with other companies to help you do this. Leverage additional insights into that recognition to be able to give them a better experience. And that's really what you're trying to do, is to say, hey, as a customer, I recognize you've engaged with my brand before, and I recognize that you're in the middle of doing something, and we want to help you complete that task. Or I want to recognize that you're an important customer, and that there might be ways in which I can serve you better or in a different way than I had in the past. And so recognition is still important, the ability to recognize those customers. And you want to try to split that, in terms of like anonymous and known, and try to get above 50% in terms of the recognition in terms of your site is really kind of a benchmark for us in terms of helping our customers.
Yeah, that's great. So as we look at, what are some key things I would, want everyone to take away from this call? The first, as I hopefully sort of drove home at the beginning, is that the end is already here. The Google's extension is not giving you extra runway. We're at the end. The majority of, other adopted browsers are no longer accepting these. So just start acting like they're already gone, because in many cases within the different business use cases, you might be relying on things like third-party cookies has already arrived. Next, regulation will continue to increase. It's coming, and there will be more. And particularly in the U.S. market, I think it'll be tricky for us. It's going to differ from state to state to state. There's nothing really at the federal level at the moment. So when companies are, serving people throughout the world and certainly throughout the United States, it's just going to be a continued focus and at times challenge just navigating that. So just prepare yourselves and look at it that way. As we talked about, more data is going to be classified as PII. So embracing that security and trust and privacy around any data you are collecting, and make sure it's data you really need. So if you don't need it, as Chris pointed out, you're really just building up risk without the reward of how you can go and optimize an experience for your customer. And you can go and take some actions, right? So privacy is a marketing imperative. Forrester, in some research they did last year, that said that 40% of the privacy leaders are going to report into the CMO. They're expecting a 100% increase in regulatory and legal activities. I think that's pretty clear. And that CMOs are heavily investing in consent, preference management, and other software around this privacy trend, because it really is part of the relationship you have with your customers. And so the user expectations are going to continue to evolve, and they're not going to become more open. Consumers are continuously getting more and more focused on what their data is, who has it, and who they're allowing to have it. So just embracing that and leading with that is the way to go. And embrace the transparency. It's not that people don't want personalization. People understand that for you to personalize, you have to know something about me. So customers know that. they're not against that, but it is a spectrum of what you know and how you're using it. And there's really great examples of brands who, yes, on the site, they have to have the full legalese of, what they're talking, what they're collecting and why, and, in the legal speak. But there's brands like Class Dojo, which does education software, does a really good example of this, of, hey, what's our policy on data? What are we collecting? How are we using it and why? Who's the team that manages this policy? And they actually have the faces of, here's the people, here's the leader from technology, here's the legal from legal, here's our outside advising group around this, so that they know you're really embracing this and sharing what they have, because people will then trust you to say, okay, well, if you're doing this that way, and that will help me in this way, and the experience I get, the recommendations I get, how you're streamlining the journey that I have, it will be meaningful to your customer relationship. And then, as we said, you're a data company. And so this isn't just, oh, how do I collect more? It's collecting, as Chris pointed out, managing, securing, and having everything that's part of, being a company that's going to own, a lot more first-party data that for some brands, maybe many brands, much more than they have been used to in the past. And so really embracing just what that means and what that will entail. And then there's no silver bullet, right? So Chris, I think, if you want to elaborate on some of the, the strategies and recapping those.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. I think, so we hit on a lot of it, right, just there. And I just want to also recognize even some questions in the chat around, just to clarify some of this. So just to be clear, if I haven't been clear, you need to be spending a lot of attention and a lot of your capital investment on building first-party relationships. Part of the building that first-party relationship is making sure that you're being transparent and building trust with your customers, so that you're giving them a value exchange and they're able to share some information about themselves, including what they buy from you, obviously, that you're keeping track of as well, and how they're interacting with you so that you can better service them. So as it relates to creating that first-party experience with your brand, then you can still use first-party cookies. They're not going away. Those are still going to be available. Think of like anything within your domain as a company, you would still be able to do that. Now, there are regulations around whether you're giving the consumer permission for you to be able to collect information, which you need to pay attention to. So part of that first-party data collection, whether you're doing it through a cookie or whether you're doing it through a form or live in-person types of data collection, anything you're doing, there ought to be an ability for that consumer to opt out of that data collection. And you ought to be making it very transparent in terms of how you're using it. So I just want to be, clear on that, given some of the questions in the chat, that yeah, that is where you should be investing a tremendous amount right now, is building those first-party relationships. And then I do think, kind of getting technically deeper, building second-party relationships. So the ability for you to partner with other companies or other digital trust agents to be able to expand your technical capabilities as a relationship to that information. That could be in securing that data, how to do safe data transfer, how to do things like clean room activities, those kind of things, to ensure that you're complying with regulations, but also complying with the wishes of your consumers. Make sure you're storing and can retrieve the permissions the consumer gives to you or revokes from you. These are all really important technologies. And then where to be looking in the future is maybe consider, how do you engage with content creators, and there's audiences through influencer marketing or other types of techniques to be able to reach audiences that that might be harder to have reached in the past, or just intermediated by the platforms like social media platforms. That's a rich set of emerging data you can use to understand consumers better.
So just to clarify, one of the questions was, as a marketer, I can still drop cookies on the customer's browser as long as they opted in for that. Is that correct?
Yeah, anything within your domain. And so in this case, the consumer and you're interacting on your website, that's in your domain. You can drop a cookie to be able to keep track of that. So that happens all the time if you've abandoned a shopping cart, and you go back to that website, and you can see that your the thing that you're interested in, the product, is still in that shopping cart. The way you keep track of that is basically by dropping your own first-party cookie.
Perfect. Thank you.
Great. So that's everything that we had to present today. We're happy to address any additional questions in the final few minutes that we have.
Yeah, we do have a couple more here from the audience. So one is from Megan. Advertising partners have pivoted to setting their 3P cookies to first party on brand websites to avoid 3P blocking. They expire after 7 days, but this will help as 3P cookies go away, correct?
Yeah, so basically third-party managed cookies versus being able to, basically what you're doing here is you're actually working as a partner with that advertising partner. So I think there's a difference between allowing third parties to manage the data collection itself and identity, which is that's the traditional third-party kind of cookie landscape. Whereas you're working, with a brand partner, or sorry, advertising partner, where you're actually establishing the cookie. There are expirations, and by the way, that kind of also is much more dependent on how often an individual is actually clearing out their cookies too. But yes, that's going to help, because anytime you can actually create partnerships and manage, through those partnerships, but manage on the cookie within your own domain, which is what you're describing here, that's going to help you keep that identity alive for that individual on your website.
Awesome. And just to confirm, we can share this recording. Will we be able to share the presentation deck?
Yes.
That's okay. Okay, perfect.
Yes.
So we'll follow up with that as well for those that would be interested. Kevin, I think this would be geared towards you, and Chris, you can chime in as well, is what's your advice to brands that are hosting a lot of PII within their infrastructure currently? What do they do with that?
Well, I think part of it is, okay, what type of brand are you? If you're a financial institution, there's probably a lot of good reasons why you need all that PII, right? Or if you're, even something like a financial advisor and knowing how many children I have, and those all become relevant. When you start skewing towards healthcare, that can be relevant. Retail, it can be relevant for personalizing, but how relevant is it? So I think the first thing that I always look at is, what do you have? Why do you have it? And what value does it provide to you? And if there's PII data that you have that you say, we're never going to activate anything on this, then you should look at, like, okay, is this data that we should retire and remove from our systems? Is sort of the first piece. Make sure that the data that you have is data that is relevant to your business, relevant to the experiences that you're providing, and then relevant to what the customers are looking for. So that will get rid of, hopefully, any zombie data of stuff that's all risk and no reward as step one. And then going beyond that is, okay, where do you have overlaps? Where do you have silos? Things that FullContact can do to help connect some of those silos of PII data. Also platforms like customer data platforms are very much organized around how do we connect these, but then also have permissions and layers on top of them. So I can't go in as an employee and start saying, like, oh, show me everything about Chris. You have to have all the controls around that. So where that is trickier is if you've been around for a while and you have a database of information that was built a while ago that's been filled up. Looking at the controls and auditability of that. And then, as Chris mentioned, how do you secure that? Can you encrypt it? Can you make it where it's its own kind of black box that you can't see in without the right access, but can still make the data actionable? So there's a number of ways and solutions to approach that, but that's how I would start.
Awesome.
Yeah, I would say, just to add to that, I would do a data asset assessment if you haven't done that already. Classify your data. And then specifically for personal data, personal identifiable data, so PII or any type of identifier, I would try to find a way, which is what we were describing through the private identity cloud, to encrypt that and put it to the side and replace it with a non-reversible identifier. And so that way you're still able to do your personalization where possible. And you're still going to do your measurement, and you can use that identifier anywhere in your systems, but you're not allowing that identity to leak outside of your systems. So that's what we recommend.
Fantastic. Chris, do you want to touch upon investing in a server question?
Yeah, apologies. I tried to answer that in the Q&A. Hopefully that worked. But so the question was, would you use kind of, partner APIs to do like conversion tracking? I think that's the way I interpret the question. If that wasn't what was meant, I apologize. But yeah, I would do that. So I think I'm a big believer, obviously, in first party interaction with the customers, and I'm a big believer in having strong partnerships. And I think you've got to pick and choose your partners that align to your privacy policy. Once you've done that, you can use that server to server connection, which is what we're talking about here. Like you're making on the back end a connection to their system, and you have an ability to share data where appropriate. And one of the things you can do is share signals in terms of an interaction with that customer so that they can keep track of things like conversions, and vice versa, by the way. They can also send you information back to you. So yes, I would consider that.
Perfect. So there's a lot of change in this idea of like now everybody is a data house and marketers have to be, involved in the data, and hats are shifting. So what do you think will be the skill set of a CMO 5 years from now versus today?
The poor CMOs over the past decade, when we started Hero 8+ years ago, it was, CMOs were all of a sudden spending more on technology than IT was, right? And I think that's kind of balanced out as IT became more of a growth partner, and hey, we'll focus on this, but we'll help you achieve those goals. And I think that right now with privacy, we're seeing a lot of that just land on the CMO to start. And so I think that the CMO role over the past decade and looking into the next 5 years is one that's much more dynamic, much more than lead generation and pipeline creation and revenue, to brand relationship with the customers. And so what are all the factors that go into that? And that there's a lot. And obviously those are things that lead to the key KPIs that CMOs are measured against. But I think privacy, but as a part of what is our relationship with our customers and how is that relationship strengthening with our existing customers and establishing and growing with new customers is ultimately the mandate that CMOs are being asked to respond to. And embracing the privacy change and just trends of Web3 and what decentralization means for your business. It doesn't always mean blockchain. It doesn't always mean those things, but really the disconnection of those different capabilities is the challenge that CMOs will have to continue to solve for in terms of how they engage, how technology supports that engagement, and all the privacy and communication plays within that relationship.
Super interesting. It's never a dull moment in this world that we're in, is it?
Fun space to be in.
Yeah, there's a lot of challenges on CMOs right now. I mean, I'm actually optimistic. I actually think that a lot of what we're talking about right now, we're all going to innovate. That's what we're doing right now, is we're creating those new foundations of trust in the way we interact. Once that starts to kind of disappear and become invisible and just become the fabric of kind of the digital interaction, the CMO really at that point, can go back to being, really good at the anthropology, really good at the creativity. And that's really what we need is closer human connection. And I think the CMO can lead the way there. But right now, there's a tremendous amount of burden to understand Web 3.0, privacy, regulation, the technology changes, different types of interactions with customers through digital media. That's a lot to understand. And so I'm really hoping that we help innovate all of this, so it just becomes part of the background of how we all interact, so the CMO can really focus more on the human connection.
Wonderful. Well, fantastic information today, both Kevin and Chris. We greatly appreciate all the intel. We definitely encourage a follow-up conversation with the Hero Digital and FullContact team. And we'd like to have a conversation with you. That's how we get the ideas for future content, for future webinars and in-person events. So feel free to reach out and we'll make the connection. So with that, happy Monday, y'all. Thank you for joining. Have a great week. Stay safe, and we will see you on the next event. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.